So Mike Little and Vince Marak, frustrated family members of cold case murder victims, teamed up and came up with a great idea. In December 2007, the two obtained prime billboard space on Route 30, west of Fruitville Pike near the Route 283 split. Many, many daily travelers would see it for the 2 months the billboard was up. And on the giant billboard were photos of Christy and Lindy's faces, sort of floating and ethereal looking. Under Lindy's photo were the words, "I know who my murderer is and he knows who I was. This was not a random act." And the billboard was emblazoned with, "Do you know who murdered us?" The billboard requested tips to be submitted to a new website, lindyandchristy.com. In 2 months, the billboard generated 10,000 hits. People messaged Mike Little with tips he passed on to the DA's office, and the police received a lot of tips as well. Explaining the reasons for the billboard, Mike Little told journalist Janet Kelly, quote, "I feel that the murderer is still alive and well in Lancaster, and I feel that the murder is solvable, but they're no nearer to solving this case than they were on the night of December 5th, 1975. By now, Detective Joe Giese, who had worked the Lindy Sue Biechler case since 1992, was retired. He told the Intelligencer Journal that he was always bothered by the unsolved Biechler and Marak cases. He said, quote, "I don't know which is worse, to know who did it and not be able to prove it, or to have the physical evidence to prove a case, but not know who did it." 10 years later, there was big news in Lancaster. On June 26, 2018, the DA's office solved the Christy Marak case using forensic genealogy and arrested 49-year-old Raymond D.J. Freeze Rowe for her rape and murder. The resolution of Christy's case, one of the first genealogy cases resulting in an arrest, caused renewed interest in Lindy's. As Philip Biechler told LNP Lancaster, Rowe's arrest gives me a little hope. He wondered whether the same technology, forensic genealogy, could be used to solve Lindy's case. But Detective Sergeant Tricia Mazur of the Manor Township Police told LNP Lancaster that the DNA evidence in Lindy's case wasn't as strong as it was in Christy's. The DNA had last been analyzed 10 years earlier, and Sergeant Mazur admitted that there hadn't been a fresh lead in Lindy's case in years. She regretted that Manor Township detectives just didn't have the time they needed to work actively on the decades-old case. Well, that would soon change. In the wake of the successful arrest and prosecution of the giant douchebag that is Raymond Rowe for the murder of Christy Marak, DA Craig Stedman's office prioritized Lindy's case. In January 2019, the DA's office cold case unit and detectives Chris Erb and Larry Martin, assisted by Manor Township detectives Tricia Mazur and Matthew Wolf and ADA Christine Wilson, picked up the case and ran with it. On March 19th, they sent the DNA from Lindy's underwear to DNA Labs International. That lab retested the right side area of Lindy's underwear and obtained sufficient DNA to create a SNP profile. DNA from the tea towel wrapped around the knife was also obtained, and it shared enough similarities with the DNA profile from the underwear that investigators believed they were sourced from the same person. The SNP profile was provided to Parabon, with instructions to create a phenotype profile of the unknown donor of the DNA. Parabon's report, dated July 23, 2019, detailed the suspect's heritage and appearance. He was a fair-skinned white male with dark hair and hazel eyes, and his genomic ancestry showed about 40% of his DNA was Middle Eastern, i.e. Turkish, Azerbaijani, Armenia, Cyprus, Iran, Iraq, Kurdistan. The other 60% was Southern European, Italy, Greece, Sardinia, Tuscany. This was consistent with Southern Italian heritage. This information and 2 images showing the suspect at ages 25 and 65 were released to the public in a press conference on September 5, 2019, along with a request for tips. The Lancaster authorities announced that they had the killer's DNA from semen left at the scene and from something he touched. This was the towel. They also announced a website, www.whokilledlindybiechler.com, intended to serve as a tip-sharing forum and information resource. District Attorney Craig Stedman said, "This case has never drifted from the minds of the investigators committed to catching Lindy's killer. Lindy's family, including her husband, have grieved for decades without an answer to who took their loved one. This investigation is active, and there is no guarantee it will ultimately be solved. We do, however, assure we are doing everything we can, and that includes the use of cutting-edge technology. So Stedman swore they were doing everything they could using cutting-edge technology. So what about genealogy? Why weren't they doing that? Well, between the Mirac case solve and this point in time, GEDmatch had amended its privacy rules and automatically opted out all of its users who hadn't opted in to law enforcement searching. This drastic and abrupt change, according to the DA's office, dramatically reduced the number of available DNA profiles searchable in the database. It was a crippling blow to law enforcement in the nation and victims' families, Stedman said. Consequently, an upload of Lindy's killer's SNP profile to GEDmatch had yielded no matches. So they had leads. They were working the case. They were using all available resources. But District Attorney Stedman warned against public expectations that the same result would be obtained in Lindy's case as in Christie's. Lindy's case was a lot older. It took place 17 years before Christie's. The investigation is nearly entering its 6th decade, DA Stedman said. That is a lot of space in between fresh memories and recollections of events surrounding this tragic death. Individuals with potentially pertinent information, and even the killer, might have passed away by now. But, he said, solving the case would still bring comfort to Lindy's loved ones, quote, who have suffered long enough. Lindy's family, including her husband, have grieved for decades without an answer as to who took their loved one. There isn't any reason to wait. It's been far too long. Stedman took pains to make it clear that DNA testing had cleared Philip Biechler and his wife's death. Okay, so now let's get to the genealogy. As soon as District Attorney Stedman saw results in the Christy Mirac case, he was all in on using the same technique to solve Lindy's. He said, each victim is important. I contracted with Parabon on Biechler right after Mirac and budgeted for Parabon for my successor, knowing there was more to do. Stedman was succeeded as district attorney by Heather Adams, but she was just as interested in solving the Biechler case. And someone else was interested too, Cece Moore. Cece learned about Lindy's unsolved case while working the Mirac case when she came across an article about the joint billboard. She told L&P Lancaster, quote, I always considered it a package deal. I really felt like my work in Lancaster wasn't finished. She told Lancaster Online that she developed a near obsession with solving Lindy's case and was desperate to advance it in some way. The GEDmatch opt-out situation was a serious impediment, though. And it wasn't just GEDmatch. When the suspect's raw DNA data file was uploaded to FTDNA, that database also yielded no significant DNA relatives. Cece said her top match shared only about 30 centimorgans of DNA with the suspect. As she explained it to Lancaster Online, this was a DNA relative who was related to the suspect from a common ancestor way back in the 1600s or 1700s. The DNA relative was likely a 10th cousin. Cece explained, quote, typically, to be able to identify a person of interest, we're hoping for someone that shares at least 1% of the DNA, and then you're hoping to have at least a dozen other matches that are around that level, end quote. In this case, the highest level of shared DNA was 0.3%. Cece had to go back to the DA's office with a level 5 assessment. The case was not promising, and recommend against undertaking a forensic genealogy analysis. But in the low-level matches she had, Cece observed that the DNA relatives all shared a certain heritage. There were many recent immigrants to the small city of Lancaster from the province of Catanzaro in the Calabria province in southern Italy. Historical data showed that the majority of these were from the small town of Gasparina in that province. There was a discernible immigration pattern, and the suspect was part of it. The suspect and his distant relatives on both sides of his tree had all descended from persons with direct connections to Catanzaro. Remember that the suspect's phenotype data indicated he likely had primarily southern Italian heritage. Cece told me that she decided on her own time to undertake a novel approach to solving this case. She did not tell the Lancaster authorities what she was doing because she wasn't sure it would work, and she didn't want to give them false hope. But there was a chance in a case like this, where the suspect and DNA relatives in his tree had both deep roots in Lancaster and traceable heritage to a small specific Italian region, that she could conduct a survey of geographic and immigration patterns and surnames to figure out who he was. She said it took her about a year of on-again, off-again work to begin to see results. Cece made use of the membership cards and immigration records fortuitously maintained by the Lancaster chapter of the Order Sons of Italy in America. There were about 2,300 residents in Lancaster of Gasparenan ancestry when Lindy was murdered. And through the documents maintained by this group, Cece could gather the names and birth dates of every one of them who had listed their birthplace as Gasparina and immigrated to Lancaster. She made lists of those surnames and started building family trees, trying to connect them all back to their roots in Gasparina. She told ABC News, quote, "I knew this person," meaning the suspect, "had to be fully Italian from Gasparina or close by. I worked through each and every one of those families that had migrated from that very specific town." She told Lancaster Online, "I knew the suspect's full family tree would come from Gasparina or nearby, so I eliminated folks who had kids with someone with ancestors from anywhere else." Then Cece went on and eliminated women and anyone who was too young or too old in 1975 to be the killer. Because she had only a tiny, concentrated pool of people to work with, they weren't scattered around the U.S., and they hadn't diluted the DNA by intermarrying. And she knew the suspect was a young male from this specific population. She could figure out who he might be. At that point, she informed the Lancaster authorities about what she was doing and requested permission to proceed. And then, with the list of names of men she had left, she used newspaper archives, draft cards, immigration and census data, and publicly available family lineage information on sites like Ancestry to narrow down the list to men in their 20s in 1975 who had all 4 grandparents born in Calabria, Italy. And she hit pay dirt. In researching one of the Gasparina-descended Lancaster men who, in 1975, had been in his 20s, Cece found something that would break the case wide open. It was a newspaper engagement announcement for this young man who, in 1974, listed his address as the Spring Manor Apartments at 104 Closs Drive, Lindy's building. It was a breathtaking moment. This man suddenly became a very compelling candidate to be Lindy's killer. And when Cece looked him up on social media, she became even more certain of her conclusion. Remember that the phenotype for Lindy's killer based on his DNA indicated he had fair skin and hazel eyes. Cece knew that this combination was somewhat unusual for someone of Southern Italian heritage, and her suspect's photos on Facebook showed that he had fair skin and light brown or hazel eyes. Cece reported his name to the Lancaster authorities on December 22, 2020. She told me in an email, quote, "I held a briefing with them to review my hypothesis and explain my approach. I imagine they were very surprised. It was a Hail Mary in a sense because I was unable to document a genealogical connection between any of the matches and the suspect's tree, but the circumstantial evidence was extremely compelling. It was nerve-wracking waiting for confirmation," end quote. Her suspect's name was David Vincent Sinopoli. His physical characteristics matched those predicted by Parabon's phenotype, and he was a grandfather living in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. Investigators dug into Sinopoli. They confirmed that he indeed lived at 104 Closs Drive, in upstairs apartment D. It wasn't clear when he had moved out, but he had definitely lived there as of February 1974, and continued to live there when Philip and Lindy moved in after getting married in the fall of 1974. But there was more. David Sinopoli had almost certainly known Lindy as a teenager. They attended the same school. Their photos both appear in the 1970 to 1971 McCaskey High School yearbook. She was a sophomore in homeroom 202. He was a senior in room 221. 4 years later, she would be dead. Sinopoli still lived in Lancaster County, and the investigators started looking into him and gathering all the information they could. They watched him for months, hoping to grab a surreptitious DNA sample from outside his home or when he left the house. But this was during COVID, and Sinopoli stayed home a lot. Trash pulls they executed failed to gather anything with sufficient DNA on it. They even watched his relatives' homes, hoping to obtain samples. This went on for several months, which must have been very frustrating. Then they received a tip that Sinopoli had purchased a plane ticket to leave the country. He was scheduled to leave the U.S. on February 11, 2022. He was flying out of Philly International Airport with his wife and another couple. It was time to move. This is taken directly from the probable cause affidavit. Quote, "On February 11, 2022, at approximately 5:45 hours, Detective Larry Martin and other investigators arrived at the Philadelphia International Airport. While at the airport, Detective Martin was able to observe Sinopoli, his wife, and another couple at the La Colombe coffee shop. Detective Martin observed them from the lounge area located across from the coffee shop in Terminal A near Gate A7, end quote. So Sinopoli was leaving on vacation in Aruba. With plenty of time before the international flight, he was sitting at a coffee shop table with his wife and their travel companions. When Detective Martin, dressed like your average traveler, got an eye on the quartet, Sinopoli's wife and the two friends all had coffee cups in front of them on the table. Sinopoli didn't, but he did have a brown paper bag in front of him. As the detective observed at 6:29 a.m., Sinopoli started to clean up, placing some napkins inside the bag in front of him and then adding his wife's coffee cup on top. He then neatly folded the top of the bag down. Sinopoli then got up from the table and put the bag in a trash bin 10 feet from where the detective was standing. The other couple at the table placed their garbage into a different trash bin, and the four boarded their plane. Needless to say, Detective Martin kept an eagle eye on that trash receptacle. He observed the folded-over bag sitting on top of the other trash in the bin. It was the only brown paper bag in the receptacle. As soon as Sinopoli walked away, Detective Martin reached into the trash bin and snagged the brown paper bag and popped it into his suitcase, which I imagine was a duffel bag or briefcase type rather than a hard-shell Samsonite situation. I was thinking how lucky it was that Philly Airport didn't feature those trash bins that you have to pull open the handle and place the trash in the mouth of the container like a mailbox. Anyway, it was 6:34 a.m. and the whole thing went down in just moments in time. Detective Martin scurried to a secure area, strapped on some gloves, and opened the bag tucked into his suitcase. He took out the wife's coffee cup on top. He took out the napkins. And lo and behold, at the bottom of the bag was the Holy Grail, the coffee cup presumably used by David Sinopoli. On February 16, 2022, the coffee cup was packaged and sent to DNA Labs International for DNA testing. On April 1st, the DNA Labs International report indicated there was a DNA mixture found on the coffee cup, with one of the contributors being a male. The electronic data files for these mixtures were sent to a Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania company called Cybergenetics. I hadn't heard of them, so I looked them up. According to their website, their True Allele software interprets inconclusive DNA and is able to separate DNA mixture data into genotypes. Analyst Aaron Eustace used the proprietary software to compare the cutting from Lindy's underwear to the male DNA separated from the mixture on the coffee cup. This is a quote from the probable cause affidavit. Cybergenetics' True Allele computer analysis of the data identified the DNA of an unknown male present on both items. The computer determined that the DNA match statistic between a contributor to the victim's underwear and an unknown male who left their DNA on the coffee cup was a match statistic of approximately 10 trillion. On July 16th, a sealed complaint accusing David Sinopoli of criminal homicide was filed with the magisterial court in Pennsylvania. 68-year-old Sinopoli was arrested on July 17, 2022. I hope he had fun in Aruba. Police showed up at his home at 7 a.m. on a Sunday. I don't have details about how the arrest went down, but I absolutely relish thinking about Sinopoli's sinking feeling when he opened the door in his robe and slippers to see a bunch of armed police officers standing there. He didn't resist arrest. He was held on no bail at the Lancaster County Jail and lawyered up immediately, so investigators were unable to interview him. But the DNA said it all. A buccal swab was collected from him upon his arrest, and the sample was sent to DNA Labs International for comparison against the DNA sample in evidence. Christina Servideo, an analyst, ran the test and compared the sample from Sinopoli against the semen stain on the right side crotch of Lindy's underwear. The results were definitive. The DNA profile from the underwear was 3.9 quadrillion times more likely to have originated from David Sinopoli and 2 unknown persons than from 3 unknown persons. A highly anticipated press conference was held announcing an arrest in the oldest cold case in Lancaster County. Lancaster County District Attorney Heather Adams said, quote, "Lindy Sue Biechler was 19 when her life was brutally taken away from her 46 years ago in the sanctity of her own home. This arrest marks the beginning of the court process, and we hope that it brings some sense of relief to the victim's loved ones and to community members who, for the last 46 years, had no answers." She continued saying, quote, Our heart goes out to her family and loved ones. Police Chief Todd Graves said, quote, "This case has been very emotional for many of our officers. They have shed tears and had sleepless nights." He credited the dedication and commitment of scores of investigators over the years for the arrest of Sinopoli. Speaking of dedicated investigators, after the arrest, Lancaster Online interviewed Susan Giese. This from the article, quote, "Susan Giese said her late father-in-law, Joseph Giese, the career lawman who worked both cases as a county detective, would be very, very happy to know that an arrest has been made in Biechler's death. His dying wishes were that Christy Marak's and Lindy Sue Biechler's killers would be found," Giese said. Joseph Giese died June 26, 2018, the day before police arrested Raymond Rowe in Marak's murder. On September 22, 2022, a preliminary hearing was held before Millersville Magisterial District Judge Joshua Keller to determine whether there was sufficient evidence against Sinopoli to bind him over for trial. Rather than presenting a detailed case against Sinopoli, the Commonwealth's attorneys got Alan Sodomsky, Sinopoli's attorney, to agree to certain stipulations of fact. This obviated the need to present testimony about these facts. The written stipulations, read aloud into the court record, provided that the criminal complaint and affidavit of probable cause had established a prima facie case of homicide. In other words, the allegations and evidence thereof set out in the document satisfied every element of criminal homicide under Pennsylvania law. The affidavit laid out the case in detail, including the evidence against Sinopoli. This was basically just a shortcut to say the affidavit says it all, we don't need to reinvent the wheel here in court. But in addition, the stipulations provided that DA's investigator Detective Chris Erb was prepared to testify to the DNA evidence, which was the STR sample, nabbed from the coffee cup matching the sample and evidence in Lindy's case and matching the blood droplets, which I'll address in a moment. Further, lab analyst Aaron Eustace's report determined that a match between the DNA on the cutting from the underwear and the buccal swab DNA of David Sinopoli was 130 octillion times more probable than a coincidental match to an unrelated Caucasian person. She also ran a comparison of the coffee cup DNA and Sinopoli's buccal swab DNA and found that the match was 5.2 trillion times more probable than a coincidental match to an unrelated Caucasian person. That wasn't all. While all the lab work was being done, on May 18th, the DA's office consulted a blood pattern analysis expert, Detective Scott Eelman of East Lampeter Township Police Department. The district attorney explained that investigators had long suspected that Lindy's killer had cut himself during the attack. Eelman reviewed the crime scene documentation and photographs and observed that Lindy's jeans were unzipped post-mortem, exposing her pantyhose, and that the exposed pantyhose contained 2 spots of suspected blood. Eelman recommended that the pantyhose be sent to DNA Labs International for further analysis on the theory that the blood drops could belong to the killer. Incredibly, the pantyhose were still in evidence at the Manor Township Police Department. On May 31st, DA Detective Chris Erb and Larry Martin collected the pantyhose and FedExed them to DNA Labs International. On June 16th, DNA Labs International's report stated that blood was found on 2 stains on the pantyhose. A male DNA profile was obtained from each blood droplet, and that profile was consistent from droplet to droplet. Further, the DNA profile was consistent with that obtained from the cuttings from the underwear. And finally, the DNA profile was consistent with the male DNA on the coffee cup obtained from David Sinopoli. Christina Servideo, the analyst, ran the test and compared the sample from Sinopoli against both bloodstains. The DNA profiles from the bloodstains were respectively 31 trillion and 110 trillion times more likely to have originated from David Sinopoli and 2 unknown persons than from 3 unknown persons. Now, this blood drop evidence was crucially important because the samples did not contain a mixture, and the area on which they were found on Lindy's exposed pantyhose had been exposed during the commission of the crime. There was no way Sinopoli could argue that his blood had gotten there randomly. Needless to say, Judge Keller ruled that there was sufficient evidence against Sinopoli to try him for murder. The case would be moved to the Court of Common Pleas for trial. Sinopoli was denied bail. This from Lancaster Online, quote, Philip Biechler, Lindy's husband at the time of the murder, attended the hearing with several other people. He declined comment. He left the courtroom silently as a person with him held an arm around his shoulders. Around 20 family members and friends waited for Sinopoli outside the courtroom. They waved and shouted, "We love you, David," while taking pictures and videos with their phones as Sinopoli was escorted to a vehicle, end quote. There was a lot of behind-the-scenes pre-trial stuff, but as is common, on October 17th, 2022, Sinopoli waived his formal arraignment and pleaded not guilty to the charges of homicide, burglary, and aggravated assault. In September 2023, a trial date was set for November 27th. It was expected to last for 5 days. But the trial didn't happen. Somewhat surprisingly, given Sinopoli's lack of cooperation, a deal was negotiated between the Commonwealth's attorney and the defense. Sinopoli would plead guilty to third-degree murder, burglary, and aggravated assault, and enter the plea at a hearing scheduled for October 19th. The plea agreement dated October 19th, 2023 documents that David Vincent Sinopoli was voluntarily pleading guilty to murder in the third degree, aggravated assault, and burglary, which is unlawful entry with the intent to commit a crime inside. At the plea hearing, ADA Christine Wilson addressed the court, laying out the essential facts of the case. She had a blown-up photo of Lindy propped on an easel in the courtroom for everyone, including Sinopoli, to gaze upon. She told the judge Sinopoli's crime was, quote, cold-blooded, brutal, and just pure evil. She addressed Sinopoli directly, demanding that he look at Lindy. She said, quote, "Look at her. Look at the precious life you stole in 1975. According to the Lancaster DA's website, Sinopoli showed no reaction to the photo. Wilson continued, pointing out to the judge that Lindy was a teenager, just 19 years old, and Sinopoli had delivered one stab for every year of her life. She said, quote, "These cases are never forgotten. Lindy Sue will never be forgotten. While the defendant was able to carry on with his life, Lindy was extinguished by him. The defendant thought he'd gotten away with this horrific murder while he carried on with his life for 48 years. However, we never forgot about Lindy Sue Biechler and the hard work of many involved in trying to solve this case for years, and the advancement of DNA technology that caught up with him. Because of the dedication of many law enforcement officers from multiple agencies over the years, justice was finally obtained for Lindy Sue Biechler. The DNA evidence obtained in the case and analyzed by Parabon revealed exactly who Lindy's killer was, and the sentence imposed today by the court will serve as a much-deserved life sentence for the 69-year-old defendant. Several of Lindy's family members spoke during this hearing. They had acquiesced to the plea agreement and were permitted to weigh in on the proposed sentence. Mike Little asked the DA to read a statement on his behalf. Here are some excerpts. "I first would like to thank the hundreds, possibly thousands of people who have in some small or large way contributed to what has brought us all here today together, to ensure that a murder is held accountable. It was a massive 40-year collaborative effort that got us here today. On behalf of Lindy and my family, thank you. I have an overwhelming sense of pride of being from Lancaster County, Pennsylvania today. Hard work, resolve, commitment, and values on the part of our public servants underpinned this collective effort, along with time and resources. And I hope that the citizens of this county, especially those with unsolved murders, have a renewed faith in those who put their lives on the line and those who serve to bring us justice." On the evening of December 5th, 1975, David Sinopoli brutally killed Lindy Sue Biechler, and today, 48 years later, he has been brought to justice and held accountable for his actions. May God bless Lindy and my family members to reside with her in eternal peace. Beth Clark, Philip Biechler's sister, spoke as well. She said in part, quote, "I have many photographs etched into my memory from the night Lindy was murdered 48 years ago. I have a memory of my brother Phil sitting in a chair sobbing while my brother Jack and I tried to comfort him. I have a memory of my brother crying for 3 days, of the somber moment my mother and him went to see Lindy at the funeral home. I have a memory of telling my little sister what had happened, of calling my aunts and cousins and hearing their screams and crying. I have a memory of the hearse, driving down Orange Street en route to the gravesite. People lined the streets, bowing their heads, making the sign of the cross and putting their hands on their hearts. I have a memory of my brother opening the wrapped Christmas gifts that Lindy was keeping under their bed for him. I continued to be scared for many years. Even after I married and had children, I always had a fear that something bad could happen, because it had. When my husband traveled, I didn't like being alone at night. It was easy for that memory to invade my thoughts. To this day, every time I see a butcher knife in the kitchen, it is a reminder." The years during the initial investigation and subsequently were tough. There were always questions surrounding people we knew. For my brother, there was always a shadow looming over him, casting doubt on his innocence. While you, David Sinopoli, continued to live your life, Lindy did not. You married and had children and grandchildren. Lindy did not. You had a job and house, went on vacations, and celebrated birthdays and holidays. Lindy did not. You took away a beautiful woman's life in what must have been a terrifying moment for her. You devastated 2 families and now your own. You deserve to be in prison for the rest of your life, and you will someday have to answer to a judge far greater than the one in this court. Philip Biechler laid out the impact Lindy's murder had had on him. He said, "After our first date, it seemed like love at first sight. We were a young couple with our first apartment, and we were full of expectations for our life together. My family adored her, and she loved them. She wanted to have a family someday and grow old together, the fairy tale marriage. After Lindy's death, I fell apart. I was totally lost in grief and sorrow. I built walls around myself to shield me from my own emotions. I learned that people are reluctant to talk to you about a murder. It is an ugly word. For years, as the investigation dragged on, there could be tension and constant discussion of who had committed the crime. At times, I felt that I had not been completely absolved. Today, I still worry about the safety of my wife and my daughter and her family." Addressing directly the man who had in just a few moments destroyed the life of promise that Philip had ahead of him in December 1975, Philip said, "David Sinopoli, you took a huge part of my life from me and caused an extraordinary amount of pain and suffering for so many people. While others had to live their life with the terrible consequences of the murder you committed, you got to live your life out. So I have to ask, why did you do this? While I forgive you because my God tells me to, you need to pay for your actions." Then it was Sinopoli's turn. He had several family members in the courtroom who looked on quietly, sorrow and anguish on their faces. His attorney, Alan Sodomsky, told the court that Sinopoli's family, too, was a victim in all this. He said the Sinopoli family had no inkling that their beloved patriarch had killed someone a lifetime ago. Quote, "He's married to somebody for 36 years. He has 3 children. He has 9 grandchildren," said Sodomsky. "You can imagine what they'll do when they wake up tomorrow and read everything you will write and say. These are human beings, too." Sodomsky said that Lindy's slaying was, quote, "a nightmare that Sinopoli has lived with," and he referred to the plea deal as a most appropriate resolution. When given the opportunity to speak by the judge, Sinopoli said, "I'd just like to apologize to everyone, including my wife." According to a Lancaster Online reporter in the courtroom, he dabbed his eyes with a tissue. Besides that, he responded yes, sir, and no, sir, to the judge's questions about whether he understood the plea agreement and was willingly pleading guilty and so on. The judge accepted Sinopoli's guilty plea, but he didn't pull any punches when addressing the defendant. The judge told Sinopoli he, quote, "chose to viciously stab Lindy Sue Biechler 19 times and then defile her to satisfy your own selfish sexual desires. The depravity of your actions cannot be overstated. The enormity of the pain, suffering, and damage you have caused is incomprehensible. Make no mistake. You did not suddenly develop a pang of conscience. Come forward and take responsibility for your actions. You are not standing here today because you wanted to provide closure for Ms. Biechler's family and friends. I have seen nothing in your conduct or your words to suggest that you are truly remorseful for what you've done." With that, the judge pronounced sentence. The sentence was the maximum permissible under the laws in effect in 1975 and was agreed upon by the parties. It called for an aggregate prison term of 25 to 50 years in a state correctional facility, plus costs for lab expenses totaling $25,209.56. As I've said before, I do get a kick out of these guys having to pay back the lab fees incurred in identifying them. And at age 69, it is very likely Sinopoli will die in prison. Finally, after too long, justice has finally been served, the judge concluded. After it was all over, Penn Live interviewed Sinopoli's defense attorney, who basically said, "This is a very sad day for everybody. No good ever comes of these horrible proceedings. If the Biechler family has closure, then maybe that's some good that came of it. The Sinopoli family is dealing with closure as well. They are suffering greatly." Sodomsky said the plea agreement was difficult to negotiate, but that this was a very fair resolution in a very difficult, horrific situation. Contrary to what was said in court, he is remorseful, he said of his client. He's been dealing with this for 48 years as well, and now with a lengthy prison sentence, he'll be dealing with it for the rest of his life. The District Attorney of Lancaster County, Heather Adams, also made some comments. Quote, "This case was solved with the use of DNA and specifically DNA genealogy, and quite honestly, without that, I don't know that we would have ever solved it." She said, "Justice was finally obtained for Lindy Sue Biechler. The DNA evidence obtained in the case and analyzed by Parabon revealed exactly who Lindy's killer was, and the sentence imposed today by the court will serve as a much-deserved life sentence for the 69-year-old defendant." Christy Wilson, who actually prosecuted the case, said, quote, "I'm honored to be part of obtaining long overdue justice for Lindy Sue Biechler and her family. After 48 years, the defendant has finally been held accountable for this brutal murder. Only a small percentage of cold case homicides ever result in a conviction. They are some of the most challenging cases for prosecutors. However, the dedication of cold case units and also the continuing advancements in DNA technology have increased these statistics." The former DA, Craig Stedman, who arranged for the Parabon analysis in this case, said, quote, "There is something fundamentally disheartening that the killer was free for longer than the victim lived. But there is some measure of justice and accounting in a case many believed would never be solved." Okay, so what do we know about Sinopoli? All of this is taken from terrific reporting by LNP Lancaster and Penn Live, and my own digging on Ancestry and in various newspaper databases. He has one brother. Sinopoli was the best man in his brother's 1974 wedding. In his younger years, he attended J.P. McCaskey High School and was a member of the Civil Air Patrol. According to LNP Lancaster, he was a member of the JV Baseball Club and the Aviation Club, actually piloting Cessnas out of the local airport. But I had to shake my head at this irony. While still in high school, Sinopoli wrote a letter to the editor of the Lancaster New Era, complaining about people littering in the Conestoga Creek area. It begins with, "I am concerned about our ecology." Well, kudos to him for thinking about the environment. It just seems a little hypocritical, considering he didn't give a second thought to stabbing a woman to death and sexually assaulting her after she was dead. Anyway, while at McCaskey High School, Sinopoli met his first wife, Deborah Burns. They were both in the graduating class of 1972, and they married on February 9, 1974. They remained married for 13 years and had 2 children together. Sinopoli was just 21 years old and married when he killed Lindy. Sinopoli and Deborah divorced in 1986, and he remarried Marina S. on September 10, 1987. In 1993, the couple bought their current house in East Hempfield Township, Lancaster, and they still lived there and were still married when Sinopoli was arrested. This all from LNP Lancaster, quote, "Deborah Burns was flabbergasted when police told her that her ex-husband David Sinopoli was charged in the 1975 fatal stabbing of Lindy Sue Biechler. Burns spoke briefly with reporters Wednesday morning as she watered her new asphalt driveway. Quote, "I can't say anything because I don't know anything," said Burns, whom police contacted Sunday after arresting Sinopoli. According to Burns, nothing about their life together indicated Sinopoli had the capacity to commit the act police have charged him with, end quote. She said there was no precipitating incident that resulted in their divorce after 13 years of marriage. They simply grew apart. "We got married too young. When you're 19 and 20, she trailed off. Sinopoli blending in seemed to be a common refrain. According to Penn Live, Sinopoli had worked as a press operator for more than 40 years. He started out at Steckel Printing, working there from 1972 to 2000, and then he moved to AbJack Printing, quote, where he operated digital press equipment Monday through Friday, 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. This was a family-owned company where everybody knew everybody. "We were all really shocked," said John Yurchak, owner of AbJack Printing, where Sinopoli worked until his retirement in January 2017. "We would have never expected this at all. To know you worked so many years with someone and didn't know anything about it is very shocking," he said. He called Sinopoli part of the family. More from LNP Lancaster, quote, "When one of Sinopoli's co-workers, whom LNP Lancaster Online granted anonymity, first heard news of the arrest on Monday, she didn't believe it. She told herself it must be a different man with the same name, until details emerged and she could no longer deny it. She's been speaking with others who knew Sinopoli, and they all agreed the news was shocking. Many thought of him as a really nice guy. Nobody ever feared him. There was nothing to fear, she said. It's like a nightmare. We can't get it out of our minds." This co-worker of Sinopoli's described him as friendly and sociable, although he wasn't very outgoing. He helped people whenever he could, offering up rides when needed. She had never seen him get angry, and she knew he spent a lot of time caring for his mother before she passed. This co-worker described Sinopoli as a happy person with a good marriage and a loving relationship with his kids and grandchildren. "I don't understand how that Dave and this Dave could be the same person," she said. This from Lancaster Online, quote, "People close to Sinopoli say the crime doesn't fit the man. Vicky Tyre, Sinopoli's stepsister through his mother's remarriage, says the whole business is just confusing. Tyre watched him raise his kids and sat through dozens of holiday dinners with him. She recently described Sinopoli as a caring man who tended to his 92-year-old mother on her deathbed. Julia Grossman, his mother, died on May 3, 2022, 2 months before police arrested her son and charged him with killing Biechler. That charge, Tyre said, is completely out of character for her stepbrother, and members of his family are bewildered. We don't understand, she said. That's just not him." So as you can hear, Sinopoli came across as a totally normal guy, a family man, a hunter, someone who enjoyed traveling to his ancestral hometown of Italy. He drove a pickup truck, and photos of him on his social media show him enjoying outdoor activities, things Lindy Biechler never got to do. Online photos show him wearing an Italia hat. Little did he know that his connection to Italy would prove to be his undoing. Well, everyone saying how normal and upstanding a guy David Sinopoli was a little disingenuous when you consider what else he'd done. To be clear, he didn't have much of a criminal record. But there was an incident in 2003 that shows what a total creep this guy is. His wife owned a Mount Joy hair salon called Sissy's Hair Boutique that had a tanning booth or private tanning room inside. Sinopoli was the only employee working on July 12, 2003, when somehow he got caught spying on a naked female customer who was in the tanning room. She was none too happy about this and pressed charges. Sinopoli ended up pleading guilty in 2004 to invasion of privacy and surprisingly disorderly conduct. I don't have any more details for you on what happened to bring about that latter charge, but Sinopoli was sentenced to 1 year probation and fined $100. I can only imagine how he explained away this lewd peeping behavior to his wife, kids, mother, and everyone else. He probably said the naked customer was to blame for leaving the door open. Anyway, him secretly spying on this woman like the perv that he is tells us a little bit about what he probably did to Lindy Sue Biechler. Okay, speaking of Lindy, hold on to your hats because it's time for the big reveal, how Sinopoli and Lindy crossed paths. It started in grade school. This all adapted from Lancaster Online. Lindy and Sinopoli were both born at Lancaster General Hospital about 2 years apart. Then, quote, for about 6 years, starting when Lindy Sue was 9 and David was 11, the two lived a mile from each other, she with her mother and stepfather in the 400 block of South Ann Street, and he with his mother in the 1200 block of East Orange Street. They both attended McCaskey High School. Walking to school could have taken Lindy across Orange Street where Sinopoli lived. According to Lancaster Online, quote, their walks to and from school could have overlapped by as much as 6 blocks. It is almost certain that Lindy and Sinopoli would know who each other were. When Lindy was a sophomore at McCaskey, the youngest grade in the school, Sinopoli was a senior. They could have interacted any number of ways in any number of settings, classes, the gym, sporting events, the halls, assemblies, the cafeteria, homecoming. The two overlapped for only 1 year. But that wasn't all. When Sinopoli and his first wife, Deborah, got married, they moved into the upstairs apartment at 104 Claus Drive. They lived in apartment 104D, and the Biechlers lived at 104A. The dates during which the two shared residency in the building are unclear. Deborah Burns has reported that she and David lived in their apartment at 104D Claus Drive for more than a year, and they moved out by August 1975. That month, that neighbor, Gloria Characo, moved into 104D. Lindy and Phil married in October 1974 and moved right into their apartment. They could have overlapped with the Sinopolis at the apartment complex for as long as 10 months. As Lancaster Online pointed out, quote, David would have passed Lindy Sue's front door hundreds of times whenever he descended the stairs on his way to work and again when he returned home. LNP Lancaster interviewed Sinopoli's first wife, Deb Burns, who lived with him in the apartment on Claus Drive. She said her ex-husband never mentioned anything about Lindy. She herself knew the young newlywed just to say hi in passing in the 4-unit apartment complex. Philip Biechler remembered Sinopoli. He said he and Lindy didn't chat with him or his wife, but he definitely recognized him from the building. We just don't know whether Lindy remembered Sinopoli from high school. So what happened on that fateful Friday night in December 1975? David Sinopoli had until recently been a neighbor of Lindy's. He was obsessed with her. Perhaps she had even rejected him or ignored him. He was now living a short driving distance away from Lindy, having moved out of the Spring Manor apartments sometime around the summer of 1975. We don't know if, as Lindy suspected, he continued to watch her, but that certainly seems likely given what we know happened. Sinopoli's wife was not home that Friday night, December 5th, and Sinopoli knew from observing Lindy as her neighbor and then spying on her afterwards that Philip worked on Friday nights. He drove over to Lindy's apartment, parked, and waited. Whether he knew that no one else was home in the building or whether he just got lucky, we don't know. By 7:05 p.m., Lindy came home with her groceries and went into the apartment and started putting them away. As she was doing that, a knock came at the door. She looked through the peephole. Oh, I imagine she thought, it's that guy David who lived upstairs. Or, oh, it's David Sinopoli from high school who used to live upstairs. I wonder what he wants. She opened the door. Wouldn't you? Lindy was immediately stabbed with a small knife the suspect brought with him. Sprays of her blood hit both sides of the door. She was stabbed while upright and probably staggered back into the apartment, struggling with Sinopoli. He continued to stab her, and the lamp went down. Sinopoli cut himself on his knife, which may have broken, and he grabbed the large one off the wall and wrapped the handle with a kitchen towel. He returned to Lindy and stabbed her some more, and she ended up dying on the living room rug. Presumably, Sinopoli shut the door sometime during all this. And then he unsnapped and unzipped her jeans and masturbated, leaving semen on her underwear and 2 drops of his blood on her pantyhose. And then he left, probably covered in blood, and went home, leaving Lindy on the floor and just enough of himself that his DNA would identify him decades later. David Sinopoli was never interviewed, never the subject of a tip, never named in the case file. The only people who arguably came close in those intervening decades between the murder and the genealogy identification were the psychics from California, who saw, in air quotes, an Italian man with tattoos. Sinopoli's family, his ex, and the DA have declined to comment on whether he has tattoos. But it doesn't matter. It wasn't psychic hocus-pocus that identified Sinopoli. It was a genetic-based immigration pattern survey conducted by C.C. Moore. The DNA doesn't lie. Speaking of C.C., she spoke to Lancaster Online about the cases she worked in Lancaster, Christy Marak's and Lindy's. Both are examples of what C.C. called a new class of criminals, one-and-done killers. She said, quote, both of the men perpetrated one really violent, horrible crime against a woman and then faded back into society. Nobody could have ever imagined they were responsible for this type of crime, end quote. I think David Sinopoli's wife, children, and grandchildren would agree with this statement. Philip Biechler went through a dark period, as we heard in his victim's impact statement after Lindy's murder. He went on to graduate from Millersville University, went to graduate school at the University of Delaware, and then moved to Philly, where he worked as a welder making spiral staircases and created his own artwork. He eventually remarried and said that his wife Cindy and their daughter have made him whole again. It was a long time coming, but he was there to see David Sinopoli's sentence for the agony he put Lindy's loved ones through. Sinopoli will die in prison, hopefully only after he has many years to contemplate exactly what he did and how he ruined not only the lives of Lindy's loved ones, but his own families as well. After 47 years, Lindy Sue Biechler's case is closed thanks to forensic genealogy. And if you're one of the bad guys, they're coming for you. Recently, I let listeners know about a new benefit available to them called an AbJack Insider subscription that's available through Apple Podcasts. An AbJack Insider subscription will give listeners ad-free access to every bit of DNA ID content published, both past episodes and future episodes. It will also give you benefits like early access and bonus content. Head over to Apple Podcasts and click on the DNA ID show page or the AbJack Entertainment channel to start a free trial. Thanks for listening to this episode of DNA ID. If you'd like to listen to the show ad-free and help support the show in the process, please head over to patreon.com/DNAID. And if you're interested in some fun DNA ID merch, visit the store at customizedgirl.com/s/DNAID podcast. To contact the show, please email us at dnaidpodcast@gmail.com. Follow us on social media at DNAID Podcast on Instagram, at DNAID Podcast on Twitter, or on Facebook at facebook.com/DNAID Podcast. Finally, if you want to visit our website, go to DNAIDpodcast.com. You'll be able to get all the episodes of the show, leave comments on episodes that I can respond to, and you can even leave voicemails. You'll get all the latest news about the show and important updates. Find links to our social media, merch, and a lot more. It's really your one-stop shop for everything DNA ID. DNA ID is written, researched, and hosted by me, Jessica Betancourt. It's produced by me and Mike Morford of AbJack Entertainment. Music by Connor Betancourt. Check out our other collaborative podcasts, Scene of the Crime, Missing Persons, and Beyond Bizarre True Crime.